Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 14th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being, Thus a continuance of action will ensue which will advance towards a climax. And here we go. If this unbroken continuity of hostile operations really existed, the effect would be that everything would again be driven towards the extreme. For, irrespective of the effect of such incessant activity in inflaming the feelings and infusing into the whole a greater degree of passion, a greater elementary force, there would also follow from this continuance of action a stricter continuity, a closer connection between cause and effect, and thus every single action would become of more importance and consequently more replete with danger. But we know that the course of action in war has seldom or never this unbroken continuity, and that there have been many wars in which action occupied by far the smallest portion of time employed, the whole of the rest being consumed in inaction. It is impossible that this should be always an anomaly. Suspension of action in war must therefore be possible. That is no contradiction in itself. We now proceed to show how this is. So, as you have understood, this is another kind of joint paragraph, as if we can define it like this, of the Vom Kriege, in which von Clausewitz is essentially, once again, proposing this absolute extreme reality of an unmodified and controlled war to actually come to refute it, and therefore demonstrating ex absurdo new principles that fundamentally are defined in this case in the following paragraph that is titled here therefore the principle of polarity is brought into requisition. That is actually even shorter than this paragraph that we have just read, but nevertheless it's also fundamental in its meaning. We will see it next time, but as you understand, it's very important because the concept of poles, of polarization, also in international politics and war, etc., today is a very used and abused, I would say, term. And it would be interesting if this could really be explained to, I don't know, our politicians, and most of them at least. There are people who talk about this just filling their mouth with things they don't really know much about. But going back to the 14th paragraph, let's simply comment it. So here, von Clausewitz, as you have heard, is in fact determining this condition for which, if really this unbroken continuity of hostile operations really existed, there would be a sort of domino effect in which violence would flare exponentially, fueled fundamentally by feelings and this greater degree of passion, a greater elementary force that would increase also the importance of every action. So there would be actually even a consequently physical increase in violence and also this greater danger attached to it, because more force would be employed constantly, and this would have an escalation that would reach the ultimate consequences. But in the second part, he fundamentally says, well, this is not the case, because we know that from real war, actually a very small portion of the time employed is dedicated to action, practically. So, given this first part, what is interesting here is still the concept of extreme that reappears. So the extreme, the utmost use of force, fundamentally. Then here is in the previous paragraphs we have seen how this is fundamentally mitigated. It remains as a tendency, but it's heavily controlled and modified at all times by contingent factors, and that the military instrument is always under the control of politics. This is really the most elementary and core element of the Clausewitzian theory, the relation between politics and war. So, and here there is this reference to these other, more kind of instinctual forces that would kick in fact, during the fight. Here is kind of relatable on many levels. Remember when von Clausewitz there is a sort of tendency in here also in reality. Many of you will say, well, but, things tend to escalate. Yes, of course, they do tend to escalate because at a certain point there is always one increase in the action. If anything, the military action has to start in a certain way. So if you remember, von Clausewitz has defined war as a duel, as nothing but a duel on a great scale. It's one of the definitions that he gives, actually the very first one, that is in many ways also the most important. That definition is particularly used because, in fact, he can make you better relate to things that also happen in your life. Because if you see war as a great kind of theatrical, almost sometimes abstract or nebulous thing that happens in there, and you disconnect it with the actual very, very essentials of human nature, you basically lose. You can't really understand conflict and war in itself. So the metaphor of the duel between two wrestlers is actually pretty. It's something we can all relate to, as I think we always been kind of some sort of fight in many ways, and that's this idea of the this, let's say, this hostile intentions that are pushed towards an extreme are not so difficult to relate. I mean, here von Clausewitz talks about the inflammation of feelings, the infusion of a greater degree of passion. He uses in German the word Leidenschaft. In fact, passion really meant is used also for love, for this thing. So it gives you this very physical and also sentimental feeling that humans have. And in fact, what it also calls a greater elementary force. So a force that is the most instinctual one, is the one that has to do with the real brutality, this instinctive violence that is innate in mankind. So also a force that in this sense is detrimental in many ways, and that we have always to imagine, however, controlled in war by a greater force that is the political one, that should tend instead towards reason. So also from this it gives you the idea of where he wants to get to in terms of how this pushes these passions, these feelings are going to be mitigated in some form. So, but going back to the duel, you realize that in every fight there is kind of an initial intention in which you say, okay, I'm thinking this over, I'm just saying and acting and seeing how the thing evolves, keeping my nerves, keeping my blood cold, and eventually you get more engaged and you start of kind of acting increasingly more instinctively, and you lose your control, because that's what by a certain standard we are programmed by, biologically speaking. We can't find this. It doesn't matter how hard you're trained, whether if you are a specialist of an elite corps, and you're kind of we know from military history that at a certain point in action, under pressure, with adrenaline pumping, with things going on, chaos, etc., at a certain point the most excellent and trained fighter starts using his rifle like a club and behaving like the primitive ape that we all are still deep inside. This is kind of relatable, but at the same time there is a kind of greater logic than in war actually occurs, and that aside from the very heat of battle, still directs the forces in a fashion that makes them kind of rational and kind of calculated in this sense. So what von Clausewitz is presenting us with is this kind of feeling of escalation that you can bring from the duel also to a larger scale, to war, to conflict. You say, well, there is an escalation, of violence, of war, an escalation that is fueled by the same offensive, basically, that you inflict and the reaction that you receive, until the fight is over. So here von Clausewitz postulates in this theoretical logical chain the fundamentally the increasing of importance of every single action, because kind of more energies that are psychophysical fundamentally. So they're like 360 degrees at this point, and that tend to be always greater. So to commit your resources increasingly more, and consequently also more loaded in danger, because they not only you're committing, you're fundamentally betting at every shot with a higher something, higher value, a higher post, a higher bet. Sorry, but you are also in fact losing control on the action, because you're not just using you're not much using your brain now, your reason, but just unleashing your instincts and getting the situation out of you're losing the plot fundamentally. So von Clausewitz reduces this dramatic eventuality into what war has taught us. Of course, mankind went even to the verge of self-annihilation. Think about things like, I don't know, Abel Archer in 1983. That was really a matter. There was one guy that was a button push away from literally the destruction of, at least, well, I think Europe initially, and then eventually the Soviet Union, the United States reciprocally, and so on. But this is, however, the point also that in that case, in the historical case, can happen. Here, von Clausewitz is talking about absolutes, and this is sometimes what disconcerts most of the readers that begin to read von Clausewitz, because some of them actually take the Clausewitzian concepts of absolute and extremes not as theoretical ones. That von Clausewitz, in fact, is continually stating at every single paragraph at this point that are unreal. They never actually happen in reality, for which people generally think that these immense destructions that you can find in war, also with the use of nuclear weapons, if anything, even if they haven't actually happened on a certain scale, fortunately, but they still have this very effective kind of also emotional impact on us, so for which we have to emphasize the idea of destruction, of annihilation, always this catastrophic, almost eschatological end for which everything has to tend to the extreme. They think that therefore a great destruction, like the annihilation of an enemy or of a nation, of a country, etc., corresponds to that absolute that von Clausewitz is talking about. This is particularly important because von Clausewitz has been misread continuously also in history by forces that actually employed these mistaken concepts in actual real life. Think about the total war of Nazi Germany in 1943. That was naturally an extremely powerful political concept, but it still also brought to a resistance of the German military against, in a dramatic way, where the country basically consuming itself when destroyed, even if the war was lost. So what von Clausewitz is really instead very interesting in pointing out is that you can even achieve, of course, enormous levels of destruction. You can definitely tend towards the extreme, because every war kind of tends towards it, but it seldom even reaches a very tiny step towards that in actual reality, because this extreme is basically unreachable. The absolute here doesn't mean in fact the absolute annihilation. It means literally the Latin, the etymological meaning of the term. That means that the power of war would be theoretically uncontrolled, which is never the case, as he has demonstrated. Is never the case. Politics always exercises continuously a degree of control and modification over war, and the same war is mitigated by other factors that can be either environmental, so in this case also physical, and definitely also psychological, because humans tend to have this kind of conservative, this preservative attitude also towards the efforts, etc., for which what he says in the second half of this paragraph is that the actually that in war only what is by far the smallest portion of time employed is actually spent in action. Wars kind of go bit by bit. I mean, ideally speaking, thinking about a campaign, the greatest clashes happen, in fact, every once in a while. The major battles, the rest can be definitely conflict, continuous conflict, but still on kind of a smaller, on a smaller intensity. It is a kind of a Lutvakian term I don't really like, but to give you the idea, that something where the possible action, I mean the possible, the unleashment of force is actually something that happens seldom. Given potential, especially, not that actually war is in fact not delivering, bombardments of all sort, shooting, explosions, destructions. Well, people may see that subjectively, relativistically, massive destruction. But if you really take what that is in comparison of what mankind is able to unleash, well, you see that that's basically nothing. And in the whole picture, even of the same conflict, that happens actually quite rarely. Always with a sort of calibration, with a sort of control that at that point doesn't even belong strictly to the military, but is always dictated. There is always an agenda, a reason for employing that force in that moment, with that intensity, etc. So this means that as destructive as mankind can be, so literally at this point in history and technology, we can literally wipe out the human species out of the human mankind out of the earth, but that still would not be absolute, because there would never be actually as approximately as we can reason, a moment for which a war starts to unleash the maximum, the utmost use of force, for which we magically all annihilate us for 1 second. And this is proved by old military history, actually, into which the use of force is always kind of very gradually employed in all situations. So von Clausewitz, in fact, let me see if there is something more interesting still in the first part. Well, yes, kind of making a summary of the whole here, von Clausewitz is clearly emphasizing in the first part that such a chain of action that would escalate fundamentally into an exponential use of force is something that pertains mostly to the elementary force. So the one that you have just because you're a human, you're violent, you have sentiments of hostility, instincts of enmity and stuff like that, but you're still a human, for which you have reason, and you know that if you look at history, that things really in war do not happen that way. We don't throw clubs on each other's heads until the last one is still alive. Societies work in a quite different way, even when they have the interests of the aim of kind of wiping each other from the face of the earth. In fact, von Clausewitz says, but we know that the course of action in war has seldom or never this unbroken continuity. What is interesting here says seldom or never. So if von Clausewitz says seldom or never, you can be sure that it's basically never, because that's still an absolute he's talking about. So this course of action never quite reaches that. And even though there are definitely those seldom occasions in which this seems to be the case, it's actually never the case, as destructive as war can be. This is a very important lesson, because I think that war is often, as we say basically all times in these videos on Von Clausewitz, perceived in this kind of very strongly ideological, radical and fundamentalistic ways, for which at one point war is either all evil or it's okay, or something like, that is more tied to your feelings than what reality really is. So if you instead start looking at war in the Clausewitzian way, you actually understand what it is, because you don't discount anything from one side or another. You realize how destructive war can be, how crude, how cynical, and how logical and rational can be sometimes. But you can also see the benefit of a not of war in itself, but definitely of the reasons for which you're employing force in that sense, because that does not depend on war, but it depends just on your intention. So also the degree of violence and the degree of destruction that you want to employ does not have a value in itself. It's mostly related to the causes and the consequences that it produces, like with every action. So what you should focus fundamentally in order to use it is on the reasons that you are definitely employing for recurring to war, and the potential consequences, because definitely wars have pretty crude consequences, and not just in the sheer level of destructions, but also giving making an impression of those who survive and have to cope with the same, with the military operation in itself. But this is another concept. Excuse me for the digression. So the important thing is that Von Clausewitz says now is that this unbroken continuity, this continuous escalation, this driving towards the extreme, happens actually very seldom or never. And that there have been many wars in which action occupied by far the smallest portion of time employed, the whole of the rest being consumed in inaction. So also in here, many wars basically means all the wars, because frankly I don't know a single war that were actually there have been definitely sudden attacks and stuff like that, but kind of every war had this kind of time for putting itself in motion, this length into which the action proper in terms of combat, etc., has been a minority part of the war. That this also naturally at that point doesn't depend on war itself. It depends also on who is using that military instrument, for which reason, over which objective. So it doesn't pertain to war. It's always this escalation actually never exists, because it's always mitigated by those factors. So here it says it is impossible that this should always be an anomaly. Here also Von Clausewitz is, I'm not saying he's joking, because actually he's very serious in here, but I love the way he's able to express very clear principles, but with a very rarely radical dialectics. It's not, for instance, I use way more, aside from being much less proper definitely than Von Clausewitz, and this is not a surprise, but I try to use more kind of punching lines and effective pictures to swing between these extremes, trying to make it understand. Von Clausewitz has a much more calm approach. Here he says not that this is how things go normally. So he doesn't want to sound too pretentious, too arrogant. He doesn't need that. He simply says it is impossible that this should be always an anomaly. So in other words, it definitely happens all the times in different degrees, and always tendentially towards this larger part of the action of the operation employed just the smallest portion of time. And he says, suspension of action in war must therefore be possible. That is no contradiction in itself. So here he is referring to the previous paragraph, the 13th, and also the 12th, from which he had proceeded, like just he's doing now, eventually considering the 15th paragraph, where he had been talking about the suspension of action, in fact, as explainable as only for the waiting for a more favorable moment for action. Only also in this sense is meant just given this theoretical picture that is developing and discovering bit by bit. Of course, there are many other reasons for which you have to wait that are not strictly military. There can be other reasons, there might be political ones. So at this point, the action can be suspended and controlled and modified very easily, very quickly. So here he is actually just repeating the same concept, just in other terms. So it says suspension of action in war must be therefore possible. That is no contradiction in itself. So there is nothing contradictory in looking at military history as a whole, and noticing that this is pretty much that occupying just a tiny portion of time with action is perfectly normal. So we can't, we will understand these concepts actually even more clearly when we will get to the to the part in which von Clausewitz explains the importance of military history. So the value that military history has as experience of, in fact, military events in defining military theory as well. So here, in other words, von Clausewitz is accepting that human nature is the one that makes war the way it is. So even though you can definitely push someone to be kind of an all perfectly efficient and ferocious and active fighter and so on, there is always this moment in which his action is going to be mitigated in some way. So there is no contradiction if in reality this happens so often to occupy fundamentally the major part of the time, the greater part of the time. And it doesn't contradict war because war, however, still fundamentally tends towards this theoretical escalation. Aside from the elementary force that is at this point just a tool, but also the degree of passion, the inflaming feelings and so on, inflamed feelings, etc. There is still a kind of a rational tendency towards the extreme in every war, because otherwise it wouldn't be a war. If it didn't tend to the extreme of compelling your enemy to fulfill your will, that would not be war. That would go into another direction. That would be other reasons. You probably would have not even employed violence at that point, quite likely. So this is also an important element of Clausewitzian methodology and theory as a whole that has to be reminded, is that we can't look at war ignoring how war is really fought historically, because military history gives us such a military history is not just this or that battle. Here we're talking about the history of human conflict fundamentally. So not something that varies widely, but has definitely always the same essentials practically, and that the Clausewitzian theory is the one is trying to describe, succeeding, by the way. And that's why von Clausewitz is always actual, because here we're not talking about one event or the other. Von Clausewitz can use this kind of crypto-ironic way of saying, it is impossible that this should be always an anomaly. He's obviously stating that, look, that this is how humans have always fought, and this is all the more important if you read it in the light, in fact, of this overcoming of feelings and passions. Because, as we will see, fundamentally the reasonable element kind of takes over into the political direction of wars. So that wars are not unleashed because, just one guy decides them at one point. There are always some reasons that maybe are not, aside from being justifiable, sometimes they can even be unmotivated, but unmotivated rationally, let's say, but that still have some dynamics that correspond fundamentally to certain social needs. You can't explain, World War II just because of Hitler as a person. You have to understand what there was behind him, as in terms of politics, in terms of society, the historical context, because otherwise, Hitler could be born today. Unfortunately, he probably would be a kind of a weird fuck, but he wouldn't lead us to World War III. And that's the real point. So what happens into war is happening for reasons that eventually translate themselves even in the same conduct of war. And if in all the military history of mankind you see that there is this macroscopical evidence that action actually occupies only one tiny portion of the time employed in every operation, well, you realize that there must be some human factor in here that you can't eliminate, because war is a human thing. As a matter of fact, it's war in itself that is made in this way, that corresponds to this dynamic. So here you understand, even aside from the concept in itself that is very important, but also the elegance and the intellectual refinedness that von Clausewitz has in explaining why certain things are the way they are. And yet he has still, so we can, even obviously having read the previous paragraphs kind of, and having all the elements now at our disposal, we can prefigure how he's going to show us why this is the case. So next time we'll see here's his demonstration fundamentally, and this is at the same time the starting note on which he will explain many other things that come as a consequences from this logical thinking that is in fact constantly chained, and that you have to follow as a chain, as a logical chain. So everything is very simple. I don't know whether I complicate the concept or not, or because maybe I make examples that suck, but this is just for showing you how these thoughts can be definitely useful for for our own awareness, and how they can be applied at so many levels. But also how von Clausewitz fundamentally has this very fluid dialectical method that allows you to make several considerations at the same time, and that he's able to develop just as a speech, as a pleasant stream of thoughts that, however, are all very logically and iron chained, I would say, and that really bring you to understand it even with a kind of a softer and more comfortable way of reasoning. Because in order to explain also a lot of intelligence, I believe, is required. And that's why perhaps I have so many difficulties at explaining certain things, because it's very easy, as I was saying before, to have an aggressive tone, to be kind of peremptory, apodictic. Von Clausewitz is all but this. So he always makes you get to the point without entering in contrast fundamentally with him. And this is particularly important because he is very much concerned about the intelligibility of his work as well, and because he's aware also of the complexity of the thought in itself, not really the complication of it, because as we have said and seen many times, the thought in itself is quite linear, but there are so many different logical steps, so that he relies on you while reading, while studying him, and on your intelligence fundamentally to bear in mind everything that is just said, because if you miss one chain, if you miss one ring of the chain, everything starts to get complicated. And that's why it's also easy to equivocate if you don't really follow, if you're really not there with your mind. And that's the reason why so many people don't like von Clausewitz. It's not because he outsmarts them, and you normally don't like to be outsmarted, unless you're a kind of an intellectually honest person. You say, okay, I have the patience of starting over, trying to understand the Vom Kriege. Because believe me, most of von Clausewitz critics didn't actually read the Von Clausewitz. I'm serious about this. I mean, you can't understand it from the same foundations of their opinions that are confuted since the very beginning of the same Vom Kriege. And if you make these mistakes as soon as you start, well, everything that follows is gonna crumble. And this is why also these first paragraphs are so very, very, very important to follow, because if you get them right, then everything comes more natural and interesting, definitely, to read, because once you understand it, this is kind of pure gold. This was definitely a genius. And okay, this is kind of notorious at this point, that if you have followed the series and you know what von Clausewitz says in general. So okay, this has been a short video. By the way, we have a bunch of kind of relatively short paragraphs until until actually the very end of the chapter. So we have still arrived to the 28th, we'll almost even we have only just surpassed the half. Then from chapter 2, End and Means in War, paragraphs start to be actually massive, and at that point we will have to cut them in several parts, even though maybe it's not this great. But at that point, in fact, von Clausewitz starts making several, considerations that are kind of easy to enucleate one of themselves. Always bearing in mind that they are all chained and they have to be understood. And there is really a lot to tell. And I'm kind of happy because, after all, I think at this point we read already almost 1/10 of the Vom Kriege. Is not really a few. So there are good chances that if I don't die, I will be able to finish this in some year, probably, with this speed. But I think it's fine. So okay, whatever. I will cut it short now. I don't have anything more to tell you now. There's always a lot to add in theory, but I leave you also to draw certain conclusions, and we will have time to explore von Clausewitz well in depth in his ideas that never cease to amaze. Alright, so as usual, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.